El Salvadorian President Nayib Bukele just silenced his critics, including me, once and for all, with a simple sentence that should be all over the dinosaur media, but of course it won't be. In a meeting with President Donald Trump in the White House, he dropped a line so good that President Trump asked if he could use it. But this isn't just about some clever messaging. This moment is a boost for the entire Trump administration and will re-energize them to continue to clean up the United States of America. And it will make their critics in the media and in the Democratic Party, but I repeat myself, have to think carefully about how they attack Trump in future. I'll play you the videos in just a minute, but first I need to set the scene. Because in my 16 years as a political commentator, I don't think I've seen a PR win quite this good before. And it's forcing even me to rethink my position. My name's Topher Field. This is the Topher Project, and I help busy people to keep up with the world as it changes around you. I am 100% viewer supported, so head over to goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com and check out my best-selling books, my award-winning documentary, my awesome collection of merch with funny and powerful slogans, and my online masterclass called Getting Your Head in the Game. Okay, back to Bukele of El Salvador and his meeting with President Trump. For context, Nayib is the man who cleaned up the streets of El Salvador and transformed it from being the murder capital of the world to being among the safest, safer by far than most of the USA's major cities. And whilst most people would wholeheartedly endorse Nayib Bukele's results, there were many critics of his methods. And full disclosure, I am one of the critics of his methods, although I'm a much milder critic than some of the others. But nevertheless, I am a critic of the way in which he achieved what he achieved. But I'll lay out the chain of events leading up to this seminal meeting with President Trump, where President Bukele arguably smacked the mainstream media down, and me along with them. And then you can decide for yourself what you believe. Because I kind of need your help in the comments, whether you think I've got this one right or not, and more importantly, why. Because honestly, there's good arguments on both sides of this one, and it's an important debate because this is about the balancing of human rights versus fighting crime and protecting people's freedom at home. First, we need to wrap our heads around just how bad El Salvador's murder problem really was. El Salvador was declared the murder capital of the world in the media more than 10 years ago, with a murder rate exceeding 1 murder for every 1,000 people in the population per year. For perspective, that's about 100 times worse than the murder rate in Australia, and, as is usually the case, most of these murders were being carried out by a relatively small and easily identifiable group of people. In El Salvador's case, there were 2 particularly violent and powerful gangs who were responsible for most of these problems: MS-13 and Barrio 18. Think of them as the Crips and the Bloods from LA, although I might be showing my age a little bit there. Moving on. The problem was real, and the people responsible were identifiable. But the memberships of these gangs numbered in the tens of thousands, so even with thousands of murders happening every year, most of the gang members were not themselves killers as individuals. But figuring out who was an impossible task. President Bukele, elected in 2019, he tried to clean up the streets the nice way for the first few years in office. But think about it. Identifying the individuals responsible for specific murders, finding them, arresting them, prosecuting them, getting them a guilty verdict, that takes a long time and a huge amount of resources. Imagine doing that, 1 murder at a time, only to find that by the time you've convicted 1 killer, there's been another 1,000 murders. It just wasn't working. There are reports, which President Bukele denies, that he actually tried to negotiate with the gangs. He tried to do a deal where they would reduce their street violence from the gangs in return for improved treatment of gang members when they were in prison. Bukele says that never happened, but the reports claim that negotiations broke down in early 2022. What we do know for sure is that there was a wave of gang violence in March of 2022, with 87 people being murdered in a single weekend. And that's when Bukele took the gloves off. President Bukele declared a state of emergency in El Salvador and suspended human rights for the entire population. Now, this is, of course, where things get controversial, and there are 2 separate but linked considerations here. There is the utilitarian consideration. Now, that's the question of whether or not his actions worked. And then there's the principled consideration, which is the question of whether or not it was morally right, regardless of whether or not it worked. The president gave his own government permission to monitor all citizens' communications without a warrant, to arrest people without a warrant, to hold them without charge for weeks at a time, denying them legal counsel during their detention, and it even allowed police to arrest people for the crime of simply associating with gang members, even in the absence of any belief or evidence that those individuals had done anything wrong. And herein lies the debate, which applies not only to El Salvador, but in fact to every human being in every country on earth. On the one hand, you see a place like Victoria, Australia, my former home, where our basic human rights were violated by our government in the name of the COVID emergency. But of course, if you allow governments to violate human rights in an emergency, they're going to create emergencies anytime they want to violate more human rights. But on the other hand, you've got situations like El Salvador, where this was no mere cold or flu. This was a genuine murder epidemic with bodies piling up. Bukele says desperate times call for desperate measures. And whilst I do have grave concerns about some of the way in which this was done, I cannot argue with the results. Now, I'm going to play you the interaction between Bukele and Trump from yesterday in just a moment, but we need to wrap our heads around just a few more things first so we can fully appreciate the implications and subtleties of that moment. Like I said, there's the principled argument over here, whether or not what he did was right from a human rights perspective, and the utilitarian, meaning, did it work? And speaking as someone who I'm not convinced that what Bukele did was right, I have serious concerns about the human rights side of things, which I'll go into in a moment. But there is no arguing that it worked spectacularly. After 85,000 arrests and the building of a huge new prison complex, notable for its hyper-strict treatment of prisoners, allowing no opportunity for them to engage in gang activities whilst they're in prison, the streets of San Salvador, the capital city, are now among the safest in the Western Hemisphere. Bukele was recently re-elected with 83% of the vote, and whilst human rights groups have expressed concerns about perhaps undercounting of the murders in recent years to try and make the numbers look even better than what they really are, and they've expressed concerns about the growing power of the government in El Salvador, it is notable that no one questions that Bukele did really win re-election with a huge majority. So whatever the details may be, what Bukele has done has the approval of his own people despite human rights concerns. And that's understandable, given how bad things were. Life, nightlife, and just normal life has returned to parts of the country which previously lived in constant hypervigilance, always ready for the next shootout, always dreading the next act of extortion or kidnapping or worse. In places that only a few years ago resembled war zones, you now have families and businesses and parties and life flourishing in peace. The results? Spectacular and unquestionable. From a utilitarian perspective, Bukele is showing the way forward for us all. Just deal with the criminals harshly, even if it means ignoring human rights. But therein lies the problem. Because if you allow the government to violate human rights for one thing, you allow them to violate human rights for everything. If they can violate human rights in an emergency, then they are tempted to create emergencies anytime they want to violate human rights. This is exactly what the US did after the Patriot Act, after the 9/11 terror attacks in 2001. They permanently ended basic human rights in the United States in violation of their own constitution, particularly the Fourth Amendment, because of this terrorism emergency, this newly imagined war on terror. And to this day, Edward Snowden, who blew the whistle on the US government's human rights violations and mass surveillance of its own citizens, he's still being persecuted. He can't come back to his home, the USA. While the politicians and the bureaucrats responsible for those human rights violations, well, they're free, fat, and living large on a government pension. To come back to my former home city of Melbourne, Australia, during the COVID restrictions, the COVID emergency was used as an excuse to place 4.5 million people under house arrest, with police violence including armoured vehicles, military checkpoints, tear gas, mass arrests, and rubber bullet firing squads being used against people like me, who dared to protest against these human rights abuses. Now, if you don't know the story, you need to watch my multi-award winning documentary, Battleground Melbourne. I'll play some of the trailer up here for you, and you can watch it all for free at battlegroundmelbourne.com, or you can buy a copy on DVD from my merch store at goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com. Now, I fought criminal charges for the crime of encouraging peaceful protest, and it took me 2.5 years to make the government finally back down and drop their charges against me. Now, we're only 4 years past the COVID lockdowns in Melbourne, Australia, but already a large and growing proportion of the population are coming to realise that these lockdowns were human rights violations, even though many of them supported them at the time because of the amount of fear in the media. A fearful and compliant population, combined with a cynical and opportunistic government, to bring about the worst human rights abuses in modern Australian history. But even with this progressive change in attitudes amongst the public, the politicians and bureaucrats responsible for these human rights violations are still free, fat, and happy, with government careers, promotions, and pensions. Similarly, there are very few Americans who still defend the US Patriot Act as having been proportionate. This is the act that allowed a huge escalation in the US police state, including surveillance, searches, the TSA, and much more. It was sold to a fearful public as necessary to keep them safe, because this is an emergency. But most people can now see that it was an emotional overreaction on the part of the population and a cynical exploitation of the emergency on the part of the government. So cases like the Patriot Act in the USA and the COVID lockdowns in Australia are relatively easy to make sense of, because it's easy to see through the emergency as being hyped up, overblown to justify the government's desired reaction, their desire to abuse human rights. But El Salvador? That was no imaginary threat. And so Bukele supporters argue that this time it really was an emergency. This time they really did need to violate human rights in order to get results. Human rights groups claim that as many as 20,000 of the people now in El Salvador's new hyper-strict prison should not be there. Now, it's impossible to know how accurate that number is without actually going through full and proper trials, prosecuting each specific individual with charges for specific crimes in front of juries of their peers to be incarcerated only if they're found guilty beyond reasonable doubt. Those are the basic tenets of a functioning justice system, which seeks to balance punishing criminals with respecting human rights, especially that of the innocent and the falsely accused. But some people are dismissive of such concerns, saying that 20,000 extra people in prison is a small price to pay for cleaning up the streets and saving thousands of lives every year. And that's true that those lives are being saved, but also that's easy to say if you're not one of the 20,000 people wrongfully incarcerated. But then again, if you don't know who's who, then releasing 20,000 of these prisoners now, without being certain of which ones are which, is to invite a return of the violence on the streets of El Salvador and make the place unsafe for every single one of its citizens all over again. It's a mess. Nowhere in the world is the tension between the utilitarian, the pragmatic, results-driven perspective, and the principled, the universal equal human rights for all perspective, even the people we don't like. Nowhere in the world is this tension more clear than in El Salvador, and increasingly in some parts of the USA. And I don't have an easy answer, but President Bukele, well, he's confident that he got this one right. And in yesterday's with Trump, he scored a PR win that will make it very hard for anybody, me included, to criticize him or indeed President Trump on this front in the future. Here's the exchange between the two presidents.
And we're very eager to help. We know that you have a crime problem, a terrorism problem that you need help with. And we're a small country, but if we can help, we will do it. And we actually turned the murder capital of the world, that was the journalists call it, right? Murder capital of the world, into the safest country in the Western Hemisphere. And, you know, sometimes they say that we imprisoned thousands. I like to say that we actually liberated millions. So, you know, like...
That's very good. Who gave him that line? Do you think I can use that?
Yes. And in fact, Mr. President, you have 350 million people to liberate. Yeah. But to liberate 350 million people, you have to imprison some. You know, that's the way it works, right? You cannot just, you know, free the criminals and think crime is going to go down magically. You have to imprison them so you can liberate 350 million Americans that are asking for the end of crime and the end of terrorism. And it can be done. I mean, you're doing it already. And I'm sure that people have seen the change in the streets. A long way to go because you're just initiating your second term. But it's clear that, you know, with the numbers at the border, you know, even in Democrat-run cities, they get a help from the work you're doing. So I'm really happy to be here, honored, and eager to help.
That's already a powerful moment, and it plays directly into Trump's narratives, but some people might dismiss it, suggesting that you can't compare the US murder rate to the problems they had in El Salvador. But actually, you can, and President Bukele touched on it in his comments. You see, the US murder rate as a concept is a fiction. There's no such thing as a US murder rate. It varies so dramatically between states, cities, rural areas, that to say that there is a US murder rate is actually quite dishonest. If you live in rural Montana, for example, you'll find that the murder rate is as good or better than anywhere in Australia. But if you live in St. Louis, Missouri, then the murder rate per 100,000 people is 69. Nice. Now, for reference, the rate in El Salvador, when it was the murder capital of the world, was 104. So the murder rate in the worst city in the US is already 2/3 of being the worst in the world. Montana, among the best in the world. Missouri, among the worst. And they both get aggregated into this US murder rate figure, which is why I say that number is actually pretty meaningless. Cities like Chicago, LA, and pretty much all the big Democrat-run urban centers have terrible murder problems. And so, yes, you could argue that Bukele's methods in El Salvador are very much necessary within those cities in the USA. So in that context, it makes a lot of sense for President Trump to bring Bukele to the White House for this meeting. And soon after the exchange we just saw, Trump turned the attention to his actions on the border, where he's been stopping members of MS-13, amongst other criminals, from getting into the USA. And this is where it turns into a PR masterstroke for Trump.
What they've done to us at the border should never and can never be forgotten. It's a sin, what they did. And you are helping us out, and we appreciate it. Thanks.
Actually, what you're doing with the border is remarkable. It has dropped, what, 95%? It's incredible.
Okay. As of this morning, 99%, 99.1% to be exact.
Why are those numbers not in the media?
Well, they get out with the fake news, like CNN over here doesn't want to put them out because they don't like putting out good numbers. They only like putting out because I think they hate our country, actually.
Yeah,
but it's a shame. You're right. Isn't that a great question? Why doesn't the media? Why don't they put out numbers?
Yeah, 99%. I mean, it's crazy, right?
We're doing
It's
great.
a crazy turnaround.
That went live to air on CNN. I don't think I need to explain how this one is such a PR win. He's called out the media to their faces, live on air, and he's linked his actions at the border to the concept of setting 350 million Americans free from crime by locking up, or in this case, simply keeping out that small proportion of people that cause most of the problems. Now, border closures and immigration problems pose the same juxtaposition, this question of utilitarianism versus principles. As it's the same juxtaposition as Bukele's actions. Me, I'm a firm believer in the benefits of immigration as a utilitarian good and, as a matter of principle, I have grave concerns about restricting the movement of human beings on this planet until and unless they've been found guilty of specific crimes. So that's where I stand on both sides of that, the utilitarian and the principled sides. But I cannot argue that despite my support for immigration, many of the people who have come into Australia and to the USA have created crime problems that are larger than what our own domestic population has. In the case of the USA, it is the exact same gangs as were creating the problems in El Salvador, MS-13, Barrio 18, and those gangs are adding to their own homegrown gangs. I'm not discounting that the USA's got some serious homegrown violence problems as well, particularly in their densely populated democratic cities. But there's also no doubting that a proportion of the people who have entered the US illegally have brought a disproportionate amount of violence with them. And the same's true here in Australia. We've got a wave of previously unseen carjackings, violent home invasions, machete fights in the streets, and that's almost universally being done by recent arrivals who are being released repeatedly back onto the streets where they just reoffend only to get caught and then re-released all over again. So, what do we do about them? How do we balance the utilitarian versus the principled? Well, actually, in Australia, it's really quite simple because we can do both at the same time. These individuals, well, they're known and they are accused of specific crimes. And given that they have already reoffended whilst out on bail, they should all be simply rounded up, remanded in custody until their trials, problem solved, and there's no human rights violations needed. In the US, it's more complicated. They have a population of 350 million people, and their undocumented migrant population is equal to about half of the total Australian population, with something like 13 or so million people. That's a much more complicated problem to solve. And yes, the vast majority of those people, those undocumented migrants, the illegal immigrants, the vast majority are peacefully working hard and raising their families, causing no trouble, and they're contributing to the American economy and life. But among them are some of the worst and most violent people imaginable, who are now terrorizing the communities around them just like they did when they were in El Salvador. Is it any wonder that many Americans are willing to put aside their principled human rights arguments in favor of just cold, hard pragmatism? Round them up. This exchange with Bukele will, without doubt, spur on the pragmatists and give ammunition to the Trump administration to double down on their efforts. And without question, Trump's meeting with Bukele yesterday was a PR win of historic proportions. Me? I'll be honest, if I were the President of the United States, I don't know what I would do about this. I know what I would do here in Australia because that's a relatively easy one. But in the US? Having experienced the human rights abuses of Premier Daniel Andrews during COVID lockdowns, I am very wary of allowing any emergency to justify the suspension of human rights anywhere for pretty much any reason. But on the other hand, I can completely understand why, for example, the people of El Salvador absolutely love what Bukele has done for them, human rights abuses and all. I can certainly understand the enthusiasm in the US for Trump to take a similar hard line there. I don't know. Jump in the comments and help me out. Is there a way to have our cake and eat it too? Could the US preserve human rights and yet still get the results and deal with their real world murder crisis, which they have in particular in Democrat run cities? And if there isn't a way to have their cake and eat it too, to preserve human rights whilst getting those results, if it's true that sometimes situations get so bad that we have to accept some abuses of power just to get those results, some breaking of our principles in exchange for utilitarian outcomes, how do we balance that? And how do we protect against governments abusing those powers and those opportunities? This isn't just some highfalutin abstract argument to be had amongst academics and activists. This is a real world question, which demands real world solutions. We have these problems here in Australia, in the US, in El Salvador, and we need to figure out the answers to these questions for the sake of us all. And I've got to be honest, I need your help on this one. My name's Topher Field. This is the Topher Project, and I help busy people like you to keep up with the world as it changes around us. And yes, sometimes I ask busy people like you to help me to make sense of the world as well. Now, I am 100% viewer supported, so if this video has activated your grey stuff, then head over to goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com and grab a copy of my best-selling books, my award-winning DVD, Battleground Melbourne, my t-shirts, my hoodies. Please leave me a like, get involved in the comments, subscribe, and YouTube thinks that you're going to like this video of mine as well. So why not check that out while you're here? Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, and as always, stay free.